Hey guys, tonight we're exploring the 64 dark psychology lessons that reveal how influence really works, beneath the surface, beyond awareness, in the shadows where your decisions are actually made. Before we begin, here's a warning. What you're about to hear isn't about becoming manipulative. It's about recognizing manipulation when it's being used against you. Let's start. Lesson 1. The Reticular Activating System Hijack. At the base of your brainstem, there's a small cluster of neurons called the reticular activating system. Right now, as you listen to my voice, it's working, filtering, deciding what gets through to your conscious awareness and what gets discarded. Your RAS doesn't just filter sensory information. It filters ideas, concepts, patterns, and it can be programmed through simple repetition. When someone introduces a word or concept into your environment repeatedly, your RAS begins treating it as important. Not because it is important, but because frequency signals relevance. This is how manipulative people install perspectives without argument. They repeat a frame until your brain starts prioritizing information that confirms it. Someone tells you you're too sensitive enough times, and your RAS begins scanning your behavior for evidence. You notice moments that confirm it. You filter out contradictions. Your attention has been hijacked. They're not changing your mind. They're changing what your mind notices. Quick pause here before we proceed further. If this type of valuable content is your thing, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps. Back to the topic now. Lesson 2. Proprioceptive Dissonance as Submission Training. Your body has an invisible boundary around it. Personal space. Your nervous system knows exactly where that boundary is, and when someone crosses it, your body registers threat automatically. But watch what happens when someone repeatedly invades that space in small ways. Standing too close during conversations, touching your arm while talking, adjusting your collar or posture. Each violation is minor enough that calling it out seems ridiculous. So your conscious mind overrides the alarm your body is sending. This creates a split. Your nervous system says danger. Your social conditioning says be polite. And over time, something breaks. Not the invasions, your threat detection system. Your body learns to accept boundary violations as normal. By the time larger encroachments happen, your alarm system has been trained into silence. They're not just dominating your space. They're reconditioning your instinct to resist. Lesson 3. The Anterior Cingulate Cortex Exploitation. There's a region in your brain that detects conflict between what you believe and what you're hearing. The anterior cingulate cortex. When information contradicts your existing beliefs, this area lights up and generates discomfort. Psychological tension. The feeling that something doesn't fit. Skilled manipulators deliberately create this discomfort repeatedly, then offer resolution, but only if you adopt their framework. Your brain craves relief from the tension more than it craves accuracy. So unconsciously, you begin bending your beliefs toward their narrative just to eliminate the discomfort. They're not winning arguments through better logic. They're making disagreement neurologically expensive. Each time you resist their frame, your brain punishes you with tension. Each time you accept it, you get relief. Eventually, your beliefs shift not because you were persuaded, but because your brain learned that agreement feels better than resistance. Lesson 4. Dopamine intermittency in behavioral capture. Imagine a slot machine. You don't know when it will pay out, so every pull carries possibility. Your dopamine system becomes hypersensitive to that uncertainty. You keep playing not because you're winning, but because you might win. The unpredictability is more addictive than consistent reward. Now apply that to human attention. When someone gives you validation, affection, or approval on an unpredictable schedule, warm one day, cold the next, attentive then absent, your dopamine system responds the same way. Your behavior becomes increasingly oriented around securing the next hit. You check your phone obsessively. You modify your behavior hoping to trigger their approval. You can't stop thinking about them. This is why intermittent reinforcement creates deeper psychological hooks than steady affection. Your brain is being trained to obsess over the source of unpredictable reward. They're not being inconsistent by accident. They're creating addiction through variable reinforcement. Lesson 5. The amygdala priming effect. Your amygdala is your threat detector. It's scanning constantly for danger signals. And here's what makes it exploitable. It can be activated without you consciously feeling afraid. Subtle threat cues, an ambiguous facial expression, a slight tonal shift, a pause that lasts a beat too long, can prime your amygdala without triggering obvious fear. Once primed, it doesn't turn off. It stays activated, quietly running in the background, interpreting everything through a lens of potential danger. Now you're in a conversation with someone whose amygdala priming cues have put your nervous system on alert. They haven't threatened you directly, but your threat detection system interprets their subsequent neutral statements as potentially dangerous. You become more compliant, less likely to challenge them, more careful with your words. They don't need to threaten you overtly. They just need to keep your nervous system in a state of vague, undefined alertness. Your body does the rest, making you easier to control. Lesson 6. Working memory saturation as resistance bypass. Your working memory, the mental workspace where you analyze information in real time, can hold approximately 4 chunks of information at once. That's it. For items, when someone floods a conversation with rapid topic shifts, complex scenarios, multiple threads, or intense emotion, they exceed your cognitive bandwidth. You're using all your working memory just to track what's being said. There's no capacity left for analysis, for questioning embedded assumptions, for noticing logical gaps. This is why high-pressure sales tactics work, why aggressive arguments feel disorienting. Your analytical capacity has been deliberately overloaded. And in that overloaded state, suggestions and frames slip past your critical thinking because you're struggling just to follow the conversation. Your cognition is being deliberately saturated so resistance becomes impossible. Lesson 7. The Insula and Disgust Generalization. Deep in your brain, there's a region called the insula. It processes disgust, both physical disgust, like rotting food, and moral disgust, like unfairness or betrayal. These two types of disgust share overlapping neural circuitry, which creates an exploitable vulnerability. When someone associates a person, idea, or group with subtle disgust cues, visceral language, facial expressions of revulsion, metaphors of contamination, your brain begins processing moral disagreement as physical disgust. The idea doesn't just seem wrong. It feels dirty, contaminating, repulsive. This makes rational engagement nearly impossible because your immune system has been recruited into an ideological battle. You're not disagreeing anymore. You're experiencing the same gut-level revulsion you'd feel towards spoiled meat. They're not changing your mind through argument. They're weaponizing your disgust response against ideas, making certain thoughts literally feel unclean. Lesson 8. Theta wave suggestibility windows. Your brain's electrical activity shifts throughout the day, cycling through different wave patterns. Beta waves when you're alert, alpha when relaxed, and theta waves, slow, rhythmic patterns that occur when you're drowsy, meditating, driving on autopilot, or absorbed in repetitive activity. Theta states dramatically increase suggestibility. Your critical thinking goes offline. Your analytical prefrontal cortex quiets, and suggestions bypass your normal filters, installing directly into belief structures without scrutiny. Manipulators recognize these windows instinctively. They have important conversations late at night when you're exhausted, during long, monotonous drives, when you're absorbed in a task. They introduce their messaging precisely when your defenses are down. It's not just strategic timing, it's neurological opportunity. Your brain is in a state where suggestions become beliefs before analysis can intervene. Lesson 9. The Priority Access Fallacy. Watch what happens in any group conversation. Someone speaks first, confidently, claiming the territory of the discussion. They set the frame. They define the terms. And something automatic happens in everyone else's mind. Your brain uses shortcuts to navigate social hierarchy quickly. One of those shortcuts is simple. Whoever claims space first probably has the authority to do so. It's not a conscious thought. It's a heuristic, a fast judgment your brain makes to avoid the cognitive cost of evaluating everyone's credentials. This is why manipulators interrupt, why they speak over others, Why they dominate conversational space before anyone else can establish a competing frame. By the time you've processed what they're saying, the hierarchy is already set. You're responding to their framing, arguing within their terms, accepting their premise. You're not deferring because they're right. You're deferring because they claim the perceptual territory first, and your brain interpreted that as a signal of status. By the time you analyze the actual content, you're already positioned as the responder rather than the frame setter. The game is over before you knew it started. Lesson 10. Constructed Naturalness. Listen to how manipulators package their agenda. It's just common sense. Everyone knows this. That's obviously how it works. They're not presenting an argument. They're presenting inevitability. Your brain has a preference for cognitive ease. Ideas that feel natural, obvious, simple. These require less mental energy to process than ideas framed as complex or controversial. It's metabolically cheaper to accept something positioned as common sense than to engage in the cognitive labor of questioning it. So when someone embeds their perspective in the language of obviousness, they're not persuading you. They're making disagreement feel like unnecessary work. Like you'd be complicating something simple, being difficult for no reason, overthinking what's clearly true. And because your brain is fundamentally lazy, conserving energy wherever possible, you accept the path of least resistance. You're not being convinced. You're being made too cognitively tired to resist. Lesson 11. The Granularity Asymmetry Trap. There's a particular kind of power that comes from precision. When someone can name exactly what they're feeling, define precisely what they mean, parse subtle distinctions you've never articulated, they gain definitional authority. It doesn't matter if their definitions are accurate. It doesn't matter if their distinctions are meaningful. What matters is that they have language and you don't. They can describe the interaction with conceptual granularity that makes your vague sense of unease seem like confusion rather than legitimate perception. This is the granularity asymmetry trap. Your experience becomes interpreted through their vocabulary. You start using their words to describe what's happening to you. And once you're speaking their language, you're thinking in their categories. Over time, you lose the ability to conceptualize alternatives because you've lost the language to think outside their framework. They don't need to be right. They just need to be more articulate than your confusion. And in that articulation gap, they gain control over how reality is named and understood. Lesson 12. Force perspective through environmental curation. Your perceptual system builds models of reality from available data. That's not a flaw. It's how cognition works. You can't know what you're not exposed to. You can't consider what you haven't encountered. Manipulators understand this. So they don't argue with your beliefs directly. They control your information environment. They influence which news sources you see, which friends you spend time with, which physical spaces you occupy, which conversations you're part of. This is why cult-like groups isolate members. Why abusive partners slowly limit your social access. They're not preventing you from learning the truth. They're starving your perspective until it collapses into theirs through sheer informational deprivation. You think you're forming opinions based on evidence, but they've curated the evidence pool. Your reasoning is sound, but it's operating on a data set they've filtered. They're not arguing with your mind. They're controlling what your mind has access to. Lesson 13. The Somatic Marker Manipulation. Your brain doesn't just store memories as factual records. It tags them with emotional and physical signatures, what neuroscience calls somatic markers. These bodily feelings guide your decisions below conscious awareness, pulling you toward options that feel good and away from options that feel bad. Watch what happens when someone consistently pairs their presence with positive physical states. Comfort, relaxation, pleasure. Meanwhile, alternatives are associated with tension, discomfort, anxiety. They're not making arguments. They're writing code into your body's decision-making system. Over time, you find yourself drawn to their position without knowing why. It just feels right. Alternatives feel wrong, even if you can't articulate why. That's because the decision isn't happening in your conscious reasoning. It's happening in your body, which has been trained to seek what feels good regardless of what's true. You think you're following your intuition, but your intuition has been programmed. Lesson 14. Contrast principle anchoring. Your perception of what's reasonable isn't absolute. It's relative. Your brain measures intensity, value, and extremity against recent comparison points, not against some objective scale. Manipulators exploit this by establishing extreme anchors. They make a dramatic initial request. They present worst-case scenarios. They have intense emotional displays. Then they present their actual agenda, which seems moderate by contrast. This isn't compromise. This is perceptual bracketing. By controlling the frame of reference, by setting the extremes, they make you accept positions you'd normally reject. Because your brain isn't measuring their request against your values. It's measuring their request against the more extreme position they anchored you to first. They make the unreasonable seem reasonable by first presenting the unthinkable. And you accept it, grateful it's not worse, never noticing that not worse is still far beyond what you'd have accepted without the anchor. Lesson 15. The Spotlight Effect Inversion. Most people overestimate how much others notice their behavior. Psychologists call this the spotlight effect. You feel like you're being watched more than you actually are. But manipulators don't correct this cognitive bias. They amplify it. Through casual references to what people think, strategic comments made in front of witnesses, or implied social monitoring. They make you feel perpetually observed and evaluated. Every action feels like it's being judged. Every choice feels like it's being recorded. This forces you into performative behavior. You're not acting according to your values or preferences. You're managing their perception, trying to avoid judgment, trying to maintain an image. And in that performance, they gain control over your actions without ever giving you a direct command. You're not being told what to do. You're being made so terrified of judgment that you police yourself on their behalf. They've turned your self-consciousness into a control mechanism. Lesson 16. Prediction Error Minimization Exploitation. Your brain is a prediction machine. It's constantly generating models of what will happen next, and when reality violates those predictions, it experiences distress. Not just mild discomfort, actual neurological stress from prediction errors. Manipulators create stable patterns in their behavior. Reliable, consistent, predictable. Your brain builds a model. Then they strategically violate it. Warm one day, cold the next. Reliable, then suddenly absent. Supportive, then inexplicably critical. Each violation creates a prediction error. And your brain, desperate to restore predictability, dedicates enormous resources to modeling their behavior. You can't stop thinking about them, analyzing their patterns, trying to figure out what triggers the shifts. This keeps you mentally captured. You're not choosing to focus on them. Your brain is compulsively trying to resolve the prediction errors they keep generating. They're giving them your attention without earning it, simply by being unpredictable enough to keep your predictive system in a state of constant, frustrated engagement. Lesson 17. Presupposition Loading. Listen carefully to this question. Why do you always react so defensively? Before you even answer, 3 claims have already been smuggled into your mind. That you're defensive, that it's a pattern, that it's a problem. None of these were argued for. None were defended. But all were presupposed, embedded in the grammar itself. And here's the trap. To process the sentence, your brain has to accept the presuppositions. That's how language works. You can't parse the question without temporarily accepting its embedded assumptions as true. By the time you formulate a response, you're already operating within their frame. If you deny being defensive, you're engaging with their premise, which validates it as a reasonable thing to discuss. If you explain why you reacted that way, you've accepted that your reaction was defensive. The argument is over before it starts because the question contained a conclusion. This is presupposition loading. The most important claims aren't stated. They're embedded in the structure of sentences where they bypass analysis and install directly into your thinking. Lesson 18. Nominalization as responsibility diffusion. Watch what happens when actions become nouns. I made mistakes becomes mistakes were made. I didn't tell you becomes there was miscommunication. I hurt you becomes there was hurt. This grammatical transformation, turning verbs into abstract nouns, removes agency and accountability from language. Concrete actions committed by specific people become ambient conditions, events that happened. circumstances that arose. The language itself obscures causation. When someone says mistakes were made, your brain processes it like weather, unfortunate, but no one's fault. The grammar makes it feel petty to ask who made the mistakes. You'd be demanding accountability for what the language has framed as a natural occurrence. Manipulators use nominalization to discuss harmful behavior without admitting participation. They're not denying responsibility. They're using grammar to make responsibility disappear from the sentence entirely. And once it's gone from the language, it becomes difficult to locate in reality. Lesson 19. The strategic passive voice. You were hurt sounds different from I hurt you. Same event, completely different moral architecture. Passive voice hides the actor. It frames harm as something that happened to you rather than something someone did to you. The perpetrator becomes a witness. The action becomes a condition you found yourself in. This isn't just style. It's moral revision through grammar. When someone consistently describes their harmful actions in passive voice, they're training you to experience mistreatment as unfortunate circumstance rather than deliberate choice. Over time, this corrodes your ability to maintain boundaries, because boundaries require you to identify who did what to whom. But the language has removed the who. You're left with free-floating harm that seems to have no source, which makes responding to it feel unreasonable. You were hurt. It happened. But who hurt you? The grammar won't say. And in that grammatical silence, accountability dissolves. Lesson 20. Modal verb manipulation of obligation. The difference between could, should, must, and will seems subtle. But these modal verbs create gradients of compulsion that manipulators exploit strategically. It starts as a suggestion. You could help me with this. Harmless. Optional. Just raising a possibility. You agree because there's no pressure. Next time, you should help me with this. The shift is slight, but now there's moral weight. Should implies obligation. Declining now feels like a moral failure, not just a preference. Then, you must help me with this. Should has become must. The obligation has hardened into necessity. Finally, you will help me with this. Not a request, not even a command. A statement of what will happen. Inevitability. Each shift increases pressure while maintaining plausible deniability. They're never technically ordering you. But the linguistic progression creates a gravity well of obligation that becomes increasingly difficult to resist. By the time you're at will, refusing feels like denying reality itself. Lesson 21. Pronoun shifting and collective coercion. Pronouns do quiet, powerful work. I, you, and we create different social realities, and manipulators shift between them strategically. I think we should do this. Sounds collaborative, doesn't it? But notice what just happened. I think signals individual opinion. We should presumes shared intention. The sentence smuggled in a collective commitment you never made. Or, you know how things are. You might not know, but the pronoun you forces you into claimed shared knowledge. Disagreeing now means admitting you don't know something that's been framed as obvious. This strategic pronoun use creates phantom consensus. By the time you notice the sleight of hand, you're already cast as the person breaking an agreement that was never actually made. The we did all the work, manufacturing collective intention through grammar alone. Lesson 22. Semantic satiation as meaning erosion. Say a word enough times, and something strange happens. It stops meaning anything. The sound becomes divorced from the concept. Psychologists call this semantic satiation, when repetition causes temporary meaning loss through neurological adaptation. Manipulators weaponize this. They overuse emotionally charged words, abuse, disrespect, trauma, gaslighting, applying them to increasingly minor situations until the words become emptied signifiers. Background noise. Once these words lose their weight, real instances of the problems become harder to articulate and easier to dismiss. You say, that was abusive, and it carries no impact because the word has been drained of meaning through overuse. They're not defending their behavior directly. They're destroying your ability to name it. By the time something genuinely serious happens, the vocabulary you need to describe it has been rendered meaningless through repetition. The weapon has been removed from your arsenal. Lesson 23. the false binary construction. Either you trust me or you don't. Simple statement. Devastating trap. This forces complex, multidimensional reality into an artificial binary. It eliminates the middle ground where most truth actually lives. Partial trust. Context-dependent trust. Trust that's been damaged but might be rebuilt. Trust in some areas, but not others. All of that nuance disappears in the binary. You're offered exactly two options, and one is unacceptable. So you choose the other, even if it's not actually true, because the grammar left you nowhere else to go. Manipulators use false binaries to corner you into positions that serve their interests. Nuanced responses seem like evasion. Complexity looks like confusion. You're not being offered a choice. You're being cornered by grammar into a position where only one answer is socially viable. Lesson 24. Temporal verb distortion. Verb tenses do more than indicate when something happened. They shape your psychological relationship to events. Watch what happens when someone discusses past harm in present tense. You're always doing this. The past becomes present. The event becomes a pattern. Your historical action becomes your defining characteristic. This makes the problem feel ongoing, unfixable, essential to who you are. Or the reverse, describing ongoing problems in past tense. That was then. We had some issues. The present becomes past. Active problems become historical. Things that are still happening get framed as resolved, making your continued concern seem like you're stuck in the past. These aren't grammatical mistakes. They're strategic temporal distortions. The verb tenses reshape your perception of whether problems are active, historical, or characteristic, which determines whether action feels necessary or futile. The timeline of reality is being rewritten through verb conjugation, and most people never notice because they're listening to content, not structure. Lesson 25. Core identity proposition. Everyone has a central self-concept, a core belief about who they are. I'm a good person. I'm intelligent. I'm loyal. I'm strong. This isn't vanity. It's psychological infrastructure. Your identity is how you navigate the world. Manipulators identify this core belief, then structure interactions so that maintaining it requires compliance. If you believe you're generous, refusing their requests becomes evidence that you're actually selfish. If you pride yourself on being reasonable, disagreeing with them becomes proof you're irrational. If you think you're a good friend, setting boundaries becomes betrayal. They don't attack your identity directly. They attach their agenda to it. So refusing them means refusing yourself. The trap is perfect because the enforcement comes from inside. You police yourself to maintain the identity you've built. They just made sure your identity requires serving them. Lesson 26. The aspiration gap exploitation. There's a distance between who you are and who you want to be. Maybe you want to be more confident, more successful, more spiritually evolved. Whatever it is, that gap is a psychological wound, a constant, quiet source of dissatisfaction. Manipulators position themselves as the bridge across that gap. They imply, sometimes explicitly, often subtly, that following their guidance will help you become your idealized self. Learn from them, and you'll gain the confidence you lack. Trust their process, and you'll achieve the success you crave. This creates dependency that feels like growth. You're not submitting to them. You're pursuing your own evolution. Except they've convinced you the path runs through their approval. Every time you comply, you think you're moving toward who you want to be. Your ambition has become their leverage. Your dissatisfaction with yourself has become their power source. Lesson 27. Virtue signaling capture. When you publicly commit to values, kindness, honesty, open-mindedness, forgiveness, you create psychological investment in appearing consistent. It's not hypocrisy. It's how identity works. Once you've announced what you stand for, violating it threatens your self-concept. Manipulators weaponize this. I thought you believed in giving people second chances. Isn't honesty important to you? I thought you were open-minded. They're not appealing to your actual values. They're exploiting your need to appear consistent with your public self-presentation. You find yourself doing things you don't want to do because refusing would mean admitting you're not who you said you were. The moral declarations you made, meant to guide your behavior, have become chains. Your own stated principles are being used as a control mechanism. And the more strongly you've signaled virtue, the more vulnerable you are to this capture. Lesson 28. The shame-based identity loan. You're being controlling. You're so insecure. Stop being paranoid. These aren't just insults. They're identity loans. Negative identities being offered to you, waiting to see if you'll accept them. And here's the mechanism. Refusing their framing would require accepting the label, which is psychologically costly. So you demonstrate you're not controlling by relinquishing control. You prove you're not insecure by accepting treatment that would make anyone anxious. You show you're not paranoid by ignoring warning signs. The accusation contains its own enforcement mechanism. To disprove the negative identity, you have to behave exactly as they want. Your resistance to being defined negatively becomes the path to compliance. They've turned your self-defense into submission. Lesson 29. Positive identity inflation. Now consider the opposite. Excessive praise for traits you're uncertain about. You're so uniquely understanding. You're exceptionally mature for your age. You're remarkably selfless. This creates fragile grandiosity. You become invested in maintaining that reflected image because it's better than how you actually see yourself. And to preserve this inflated identity, you have to keep performing the praised traits, even when the cost becomes unreasonable. You tolerate their bad behavior to prove your understanding. You suppress your needs to demonstrate maturity. You sacrifice your interests to maintain your selflessness. You're not being flattered. You're being written into a character whose script they control. The praise was always a down payment on future compliance. Lesson 30. The origin story rewrite. You've always been too trusting. You've never really known what you wanted. You've always needed someone to guide you. These aren't observations. They're narrative overlays. New interpretations of your history that reframe your past through their lens. And if you hear them enough times, especially from someone whose opinion you value, they start to replace your own memory and self-understanding. Once you accept their story about who you've always been, your future behavior becomes an expression of that identity rather than a choice. You're not choosing to be dependent. You've always needed guidance. You're not choosing to ignore red flags. You've always been too trusting. The story about your past becomes the script for your future. They're not describing you. They're authoring you. And you're beginning to believe you're the character they've written. Lesson 31. Identity fragmentation through contradiction. Watch what happens when someone praises your independence, then punishes every autonomous decision you make, celebrates your honesty, then reacts badly every time you tell the truth, claims to love your strength, then withdraws when you display it. You can't develop a coherent self-concept because the feedback is contradictory. The person you're rewarded for being one moment is the person you're punished for being the next. There's no stable identity you can perform that consistently earns approval. This fragmentation makes you perpetually uncertain about who you are. And that uncertainty makes you dependent on their moment-to-moment definitions. Since you can't figure out who you're supposed to be, you need them to tell you, constantly. You're not confused. You're being deliberately shattered, so you'll need them to hold the pieces. Lesson 32. The future self-hostage. You'll realize I was right. Someday you'll wish you'd listened. You're going to regret this. These statements reach forward in time, positioning your future self as already disappointed in your present choices. This creates temporal pressure. You're being made to negotiate with a phantom, a version of yourself that doesn't exist yet but is already judging you. And because you can't verify the future, you're vulnerable to any claim about it. The mechanism is insidious. They're not making a prediction. They're planting doubt about whether present you can trust your own judgment. Maybe future you will have perspective that present you lacks. Maybe you're making a mistake you can't see yet. The uncertainty becomes paralysis. They're not predicting your future. They're threatening you with a version of yourself they're constructing in your imagination. And that imaginary future self becomes a hostage that controls your present behavior. Lesson 33. Distributed enforcement networks. True power doesn't require direct control. It requires convincing other people to enforce your will for you. Watch how manipulators do this. They mention something to your friend, just a casual concern. I'm worried about how stressed they seem lately. Your friend, meaning well, brings it up with you. Then your coworker gets a version of the same story. Then a family member. Each one approaches you independently, expressing concern, offering advice, applying pressure. You're now managing multiple fronts of influence that feel separate but originate from a single source. This diffusion makes the pressure feel like social consensus rather than one person's agenda. You're not resisting one manipulator anymore. You're fighting what seems like everyone's collective wisdom. And that's nearly impossible, because humans are wired to defer to group consensus. One person you can dismiss, but when it seems like everyone agrees, resistance feels like delusion. They've distributed the enforcement so effectively that you can't even identify the origin point anymore. Lesson 34. The Overton Window Shift. The Overton window is the range of ideas that seem acceptable or discussable in a given moment. Manipulators understand they can't move you from point A to point Z directly, so they move the window. It starts with jokes, hypotheticals, offhand comments that introduce extreme positions in low-stakes ways. I'm not saying we should, but what if we just? The idea is presented, then dismissed. But it's been introduced. It's now thinkable. Next time, it comes up again, still framed as edgy or provocative, but less shocking than the first time. Repeat exposure normalizes what was once unthinkable. The boundary moves incrementally, almost invisibly. By the time you're seriously discussing positions you'd have rejected months earlier, you don't remember how you got here. This isn't sudden radicalization. It's normalization through repeated exposure. The window shifted, and you shifted with it, 1 millimeter at a time, until you're standing somewhere you never intended to go. Lesson 35. Proxy validation through strategic witnesses. Manipulators don't just want to control what happens. They want to control what's remembered about what happened. So they stage interactions in front of strategic witnesses. They ensure certain conversations happen when specific people are present, people who will interpret events through the manipulator's preferred frame. These witnesses don't need to be accomplices. They just need to be there for carefully chosen moments. Later, the manipulator references this manufactured social proof. Remember when even Sarah noticed you were being unreasonable? Sarah becomes evidence. Her presence in that moment becomes validation of their narrative. You're not just dealing with their interpretation anymore. You're dealing with documented reality. Witnesses who saw what happened and whose memory supports their version. Reality is being archived in a way that serves their agenda. And you were so focused on the interaction itself that you didn't notice you were being documented. Lesson 36. The Isolation Gradient. Abrupt isolation is obvious. If someone suddenly cuts you off from everyone you know, you recognize it as a red flag. So manipulators don't do that. They isolate you gradually, through a series of individually reasonable seeming decisions. They manufacture a conflict with one friend, create scheduling demands that make seeing another difficult, plant doubts about a third, cultivate mutual resentment with a fourth. Each severed connection has a legitimate reason that seems unrelated to the others. By the time you're isolated, there's no single dramatic moment to point to. No clear villain move. Just a series of unfortunate circumstances and reasonable responses that collectively removed your external reality checks. You're not being cut off. You're being slowly severed, one connection at a time, until you're alone with the manipulator and no longer have outside perspectives to calibrate against. Lesson 37. Social debt accumulation. The reciprocity instinct is powerful and nonspecific. When someone does you a favor, your brain generates obligation, regardless of whether you wanted the favor in the first place. Manipulators exploit this by doing unsolicited favors, giving unwanted gifts, providing help you didn't request. Each one creates a small debt in your psychological ledger, and these debts accumulate. You didn't ask them to drive you to the airport, but they insisted. You didn't want an expensive birthday gift, but they gave it anyway. You didn't need their help with your project, but they volunteered. And now you owe them. Not legally, not even rationally, but psychologically, the debt is real. They're not being generous. They're making investments in your future compliance. And when they come to collect, when they ask for something you don't want to give, you'll struggle to refuse because the debt feels real, even though you never agreed to accumulate it. Lesson 38. The Conformity Cascade. In ambiguous situations, People look to others to determine the appropriate response. Manipulators exploit this by controlling who responds first. They seed groups with confederates or position themselves to react before others have formed independent judgments. They establish the correct interpretation, what's funny, what's concerning, what's acceptable, before anyone else speaks. Once a few people align with this planted response, social proof takes over. Others conform because humans are wired to match group consensus, especially in uncertain situations. The cascade builds momentum. Soon the majority has adopted a position no individual would have chosen independently. This is how groups develop collective beliefs that don't reflect anyone's actual individual judgment. The cascade swept them up before critical thinking could engage. And the manipulator just had to control the first few responses to set the entire chain in motion. Lesson 39. Strategic Triangulation. When someone positions themselves as the communication hub between people, they gain tremendous control. They become the translator, the interpreter, the messenger. They tell you what someone else allegedly said. They tell that person what you allegedly said. But both versions are filtered, shaped, strategically edited to serve their agenda. Neither party knows they're receiving distorted information, and any attempt to verify directly, to go to the person and ask, "Did you really say that?" gets framed as a lack of trust, a boundary violation, or evidence you're trying to cause drama. The manipulator has made themselves indispensable by controlling the channel. You're not communicating with other people anymore. You're communicating with their filtered, interpreted, selectively edited version. And the manipulator is the only one who knows the full picture, because they're actively distorting it. Lesson 40. The plural of anecdote fallacy. Everyone says, "I keep hearing. Multiple people have told me." These phrases create the impression of overwhelming evidence through sheer volume. But when you examine it, you find the manipulator has collected a handful of cherry-picked examples and is presenting them as statistical consensus. 3 people becomes everyone. 2 incidents becomes "I keep hearing." A couple of comments becomes multiple people. Your brain treats repeated exposure as validation. So when you hear variations of the same framing for the 5th time from seemingly different contexts, it feels like established fact. The repetition creates the illusion of independent verification. They're not gathering evidence. They're manufacturing statistical illusion through strategic repetition and vague quantifiers. The plural of anecdote isn't data, but it sounds like data when it's packaged correctly. And your pattern recognition system mistakes frequency for truth. Lesson 41. Baseline Anxiety Cultivation. Pay attention to what normal feels like in certain relationships. There's a steady current of low-level unpredictability, slight delays in responses, vague expressions of dissatisfaction, ambiguous disapproval that's never quite explained. This keeps your nervous system in perpetual mild stress. Not panic, not crisis, just a constant background hum of anxiety. And here's what that does. It makes their positive attention feel like relief rather than normal interaction. When they finally smile, finally approve, finally respond warmly, your nervous system floods with gratitude. You feel like you've been given something precious. But you haven't. You've just been returned to baseline after they artificially lowered it. You become grateful for basic decent treatment because your baseline has been recalibrated. They're not providing comfort. They're creating the discomfort that makes their presence feel necessary. The relief you feel isn't love. It's the anxiety finally stopping. Lesson 42. Emotional Contagion Weaponization. Emotions spread between people automatically through mirror neurons and unconscious mimicry. You felt this, walking into a tense room and immediately feeling tense yourself, even before understanding why. Manipulators weaponize this. They project specific emotional states, urgency, anxiety, excitement, doubt, knowing others will absorb and amplify them without awareness. They don't explain why everyone should feel anxious. They just emanate anxiety, and the room catches it like a virus. By the time the group is collectively anxious or excited, the emotion seems to have emerged organically. No one remembers it being introduced. It just feels like the natural response to the situation. But it wasn't. It was deliberately infected into the space by someone who understands that emotions spread faster than thoughts. They're not expressing emotion. They're using emotion as a contagion to control the group state. Lesson 43. The Empathy Gap Exploitation. Right now, it's hard to imagine how you'd feel if you were starving, or terrified, or sexually aroused. Your current emotional state creates a gap in your ability to simulate other emotional states. Psychologists call this the empathy gap. Manipulators exploit this by timing important requests or discussions for when you're in specific states. They ask for commitment when you're calm and can't imagine being angry later. They seek agreements when you're tired and can't access your energized self's judgment. They make requests when you're aroused and your risk assessment is neurologically suppressed. You agree to things that future you will regret because present you can't accurately access that person's experience. You're not being caught off guard. Your diminished capacity for emotional projection is being strategically targeted. They're not having the conversation when you can think clearly. They're having it when the empathy gap is widest. Lesson 44. Manufactured emotional labor. Notice how some relationships require you to constantly manage someone else's emotional state, calming their anger, preventing their sadness, protecting their ego from minor disappointments, regulating their anxiety. This gets framed as what caring people do. Support, emotional availability, being there for someone. But watch what happens over time. The relationship transforms into one where your primary function is the emotional regulation of another person. Your own emotional needs atrophy because all available energy goes toward their maintenance. You stop having feelings that require attention because you're too busy managing theirs. You've been conscripted into emotional servitude, and it's disguised as intimacy. You're not being supportive. You're being made responsible for an adult's internal experience, which is neither possible nor your job. But by the time you realize it, you've forgotten what it feels like to have your own emotional needs met. Lesson 45. The Relief-Based Conditioning. Here's how it works. They create a problem. Then they solve it. And in solving it, they position themselves as your protector. The anxiety they introduced through criticism, withdrawal, or manufactured crisis is relieved by their intervention. Maybe they comfort you after making you anxious. Maybe they rescue you from a situation they created. The relief is real. The gratitude is real. But the threat was artificial. This creates a reward cycle that bonds you to them at a neurological level. Your nervous system learns they're the solution without registering they were the cause. This is the mechanism behind Stockholm Syndrome. Why abuse victims defend abusers? Why hostages protect captors? The brain has been trained to associate the threat source with safety through strategic relief delivery. You're not confused or weak. You've been conditioned through a carefully engineered cycle of threat and rescue. Lesson 46. Emotional Granularity Suppression. Emotional granularity is your ability to distinguish between subtle variations in feeling. The difference between anxious and overwhelmed, between hurt and disappointed, between angry and betrayed. When someone consistently responds to your nuanced feelings with reductive labels, you're just being sensitive, you're overreacting, you're being dramatic. They train you to mistrust your own emotional discernment. Your capacity to distinguish between subtle feelings deteriorates because precision is punished while crude categorization is reinforced. And this makes you dramatically easier to manipulate because you can't articulate what's wrong with sufficient accuracy to defend your position. When you can only access crude emotional categories, good or bad, fine or upset, you lose the vocabulary to describe complex manipulation. Your emotional granularity is being systematically impoverished, not by accident, by design. Lesson 47. The Intermittent Punishment Schedule. Consistent punishment can be adapted to. If someone always reacts badly to a specific behavior, you learn the rule and adjust. But unpredictable negative consequences create maximum behavioral suppression. When you can't determine what triggers their anger, criticism, or withdrawal, when the same action gets praised one day and punished the next, you become hypervigilant and broadly inhibited. You're not just avoiding specific behaviors anymore. You're constraining your entire behavioral range because the rules are opaque. This learned helplessness is more powerful than direct prohibition because it's self-imposed. You're not following their commands. You're managing unpredictable threat by making yourself smaller, quieter, less. The punishment doesn't need to be consistent. Inconsistency is the mechanism. Uncertainty is the cage. Lesson 48. Narrative Emotion Transplant. Memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. You don't replay the past. You rebuild it each time you remember. And in that reconstruction, emotional memory is particularly vulnerable. When someone tells you stories about how you felt in past situations, you were so happy when we did that. You were miserable back then. You loved it, remember? They're planting emotional data that your memory system sometimes accepts as genuine recall. Over time, your remembered feelings align with their narrative rather than your lived experience. This doesn't just rewrite history. It rewrites your understanding of what makes you happy, sad, or fulfilled. They gain control over your motivational structure itself. You think you're choosing based on what you know makes you happy. But your knowledge of what makes you happy has been gradually replaced with their story about what makes you happy. Your own emotional history has been transplanted with theirs. Lesson 49. The Perpetual Provisional State. Notice how some relationships never quite solidify. They're almost committed, almost ready to move forward, almost changing. There's always a reason why now isn't the right time, but soon will be. This temporal ambiguity creates a specific trap. You can't grieve or move on because it might still happen. You hold space, maintain availability, continue investing. But you also can't build on it, can't make plans around it, can't treat it as real, because nothing's certain. You're frozen in psychological limbo. Sunk costs accumulate because you keep investing, but closure is blocked because the situation remains perpetually provisional. And this serves them perfectly. They keep you available and invested without having to deliver anything definitive. Time itself has become the trap. Not what they're doing in time, but the temporal structure they've created, a permanent state of almost that prevents you from moving in any direction. Lesson 50. The Artificial Urgency Generation. You need to decide now. This is your last chance. The opportunity won't wait. These phrases trigger something primal. Your decision-making shifts from deliberate prefrontal evaluation to reactive amygdala response. And that shift is exactly what they need. Because deliberation would reveal flaws. Contemplation would expose manipulation. Time to think would allow you to consult others, sleep on it, consider implications. So they create false time pressure to bypass all of that. Most claimed urgency is manufactured. The deadline is artificial. The scarcity is fabricated. But by the time you realize that, you've already decided under conditions of manufactured panic. They're not rushing you toward opportunity. They're rushing you past your judgment. Real opportunities rarely require immediate decision in the absence of information. Manufactured urgency is almost always a red flag that thinking clearly would not serve their interests. Lesson 51. Historical Revision Through Temporal Distance. Memory degrades over time. Details blur. Emotional intensity fades. What felt certain becomes uncertain. And manipulators wait for this. They don't try to revise history immediately. Your memory is too fresh, your certainty too strong. They wait months or years until temporal distance has made your recall fuzzy. Then they offer new interpretations. That's not really what happened. You're misremembering. It wasn't like that. And because time has degraded your certainty, you're vulnerable to their reconstruction. Maybe you are misremembering. Maybe it wasn't as bad as you recall. The distance makes the past negotiable in a way the present never is. They're not lying about the present. They're strategically waiting for time to make the past vulnerable to reinterpretation. History becomes whatever they say it was, because time eroded your ability to definitively prove otherwise. Lesson 52. The Future Promise Cycle. Things will be different when I get this job. We'll work on it after the holidays. Once things settle down, I'll change. The promise is always just ahead, just out of reach, perpetually deferred to a future that never quite arrives. This keeps you invested through hope while requiring no present action from them. And when the specified future arrives without the promised change, It's not framed as a broken promise. It's framed as your premature expectation. The goalpost moves. A new condition emerges. The future recedes again. Over time, you're being trained to accept indefinite waiting, to normalize empty promises, to remain in a relationship with a fantasy version of them that exists only in the perpetually deferred future. You're not being patient. You're being manipulated through temporal displacement of accountability. Lesson 53. Compressed time-frame decision forcing. Some decisions are complex. They involve multiple considerations, competing values, long-term implications. The natural human process is to take time, sleep on it, consult others, sit with the uncertainty until clarity emerges. Manipulators prevent this by bundling complex decisions into single, urgent choices that must be made immediately. We need to decide right now, are we doing this or not? The compression is deliberate. This transforms what should be deliberative into reactive. And reactive decisions favor whoever framed the choice, whoever controls the urgency, whoever benefits from you not thinking clearly. They're not respecting your autonomy. They're preventing you from exercising it through temporal constraint. Wisdom requires time. By removing time, they remove wisdom from the equation. Lesson 54. The nostalgia weapon. Remember when we used to talk for hours? Remember how good things were in the beginning? Remember when you used to be more spontaneous? Selective reminiscence about idealized past moments creates implicit comparison that makes the present seem deficient. This positions the current state as degraded, as having fallen from grace. And it implies that returning to their preferred dynamic would restore that idealized past. But notice what's happening. They're selecting memories strategically, editing out the context, the reasons things changed, the problems that existed even then. This temporal manipulation makes their demands seem like restoration rather than new concessions. I just want things to go back to how they were sounds reasonable, but it's not. They're weaponizing selective memory to reshape the present, making you responsible for the gap between curated nostalgia and complex reality. Lesson 55. Duration neglect exploitation. Here's something strange about memory. When you recall an experience, the duration barely matters. What dominates your memory is the peak moment, the best or worst part, and the ending. Psychologists call this duration neglect. A 3-hour fight that ends with a sincere apology will be remembered more positively than a 1-hour fight that ends ambiguously, even though the first involved twice as much suffering. Manipulators understand this instinctively. They ensure good endings to problematic interactions. A moment of kindness after hours of cruelty. A brief apology after extended mistreatment. And that ending overwrites the duration in memory. Later, when you try to recall whether the relationship is good or bad, your brain serves up the ending, not the hours of discomfort. They're not making amends. They're engineering how the experience will be encoded in memory, ensuring that what you remember serves their narrative rather than reflecting reality. Lesson 56. The Immortality Project Capture. Everyone has what terror management theorists call an immortality project, the thing that gives your life meaning beyond your biological existence. Your work, your creativity, your legacy, your impact on others. This is psychological infrastructure built to manage existential anxiety. When manipulators position themselves as essential to that project, as the one who believes in your vision, supports your calling, enables your purpose, they become inseparable from your deepest existential drives. Leaving them now feels like abandoning your purpose, betraying your life's meaning, throwing away your one chance at significance. This temporal extension binds you across your entire imagined future, making present suffering seem trivial compared to permanent existential consequences. They're not building with you. They're holding your future hostage by convincing you that your immortality project requires them. And because you can't verify the future, you can't prove them wrong until it's too late. Lesson 57. The Certainty Gradient Control. Listen to how manipulators speak about their interpretations versus yours. They use absolute certainty. That's what happened. This is the situation. Here's what's true. No hedging. No qualification. Pure confidence. But when they reference your perceptions, the language changes. You might remember. You seem to think. You're probably feeling. Every statement about your experience gets wrapped in doubt. This creates an asymmetry in epistemic confidence. Their subjective interpretation feels like objective reality. Your actual experience feels provisional, uncertain, possibly mistaken. And over time, you start deferring to their certainty because your own knowing feels increasingly unstable. They're not more informed than you. They're not accessing better data. They're just more confident. And you're mistaking confidence for correctness. The certainty gradient itself is the manipulation, making you doubt what you know by speaking about what they believe with unwavering conviction. Lesson 58. Strategic Information Delay. You make a decision. You commit. You pass the point of no return. Then they mention the thing they should have told you at the beginning. The cost, the risk, the constraint, the detail that would have changed everything. Oh, I thought you knew. I assumed that was obvious. I didn't think it was important. But the timing isn't accidental. They withheld key information until after you'd committed, transforming what should have been informed choice into manipulated entrapment. By the time you have full information, the sunk costs make reversal painful. You've already invested time, energy, reputation, or resources. Backing out now feels worse than continuing with incomplete information. This sequencing of disclosure is precisely engineered to minimize your decision quality. They're not forgetting to mention things. They're strategically timing revelation to bypass your veto. Information is being weaponized through its placement in time. Lesson 59. The Curated Evidence Presentation. Imagine someone presents you with 10 pieces of evidence, all supporting their conclusion. You analyze each one. They all check out. You form a judgment based on thorough examination of available data. Except the available data was curated. They selectively presented information that supports their case while omitting contradicting evidence. And because you're not aware the evidence is being filtered, you can't adjust for selection bias. Your analysis feels rigorous, but your dataset is poisoned at the source. This is more sophisticated than lying. They haven't necessarily told you anything false. They've just architected the information ecosystem so your honest reasoning produces their desired conclusion. The manipulation isn't in your thinking. It's in what you're allowed to think about. You're reaching conclusions based on evidence review, which feels trustworthy. But evidence review is only as good as evidence access. And they control the access. Lesson 60. Complexity Exploitation through Gish-Gallop. They hit you with 15 claims in rapid succession. Each one is questionable, but addressing them all would require enormous cognitive effort. By the time you've refuted 3, they've introduced 8 more. You're drowning in claims. Most people can't sustain the mental effort required to systematically address a flood of false or misleading assertions. So they concede, not because the arguments were convincing, but to stop the assault. This is the Gish-Gallop. Overwhelming through volume. This isn't argumentation. It's information warfare, where victory goes to whoever can generate complexity faster than others can process it. They're not trying to be right. They're trying to be unmanageable. By the time you're exhausted from refuting, they've already claimed victory through your silence on the claims you didn't have energy to address. Lesson 61. The False Equivalence Platform. Watch how quickly they position wildly unequal things as comparable. Your minor oversight and their sustained deception. Your reasonable boundary and their controlling behavior. Your single mistake and their pattern of betrayal. This creates moral symmetry where none exists. And once the comparison is established, you're forced into a defensive position. Now you're explaining why things aren't equivalent rather than addressing their actual harmful behavior. The comparison itself is the manipulation. It shifts the conversation from their behavior to a meta-debate about whether the comparison is valid. By the time you're arguing about the analogy, you've already accepted their framing that made you comparable parties rather than perpetrator and victim. You've been moved from plaintiff to defendant through false equivalence. And the original harm disappears in the definitional debate about whether harms are similar. Lesson 62. Source credibility hijacking. Studies show, experts say, research indicates. These phrases borrow credibility without earning it. Most people won't verify the citations. They won't check if the study actually says what's being claimed. They won't examine the methodology or sample size. So the mere invocation of authority functions as proof. Even when the sources don't support their claims, even when the sources don't exist, the impression of being well-researched lingers. You're responding to epistemic trappings rather than epistemic content. This is why studies show is so effective even when followed by complete distortions. The phrase signals that someone has done homework, has access to expertise, has evidence-based support. And in the absence of verification, that signal is often enough to win the argument. They're not presenting research, they're performing research having. Lesson 63, the controlled disclosure pattern. They tell you something damaging about themselves, a past mistake, a character flaw, something concerning. And they seem so honest, so vulnerable in the admission. You feel like you've uncovered important truth, like you're seeing them clearly now. But watch the pattern. The confession is strategic, a minimized version emphasizing context, framing them as victim of circumstance. I did this, but only because. The disclosure is real, but the interpretation is controlled, and it preempts your investigation while appearing honest. You feel satisfied. You think you've seen behind the mask, but you've received a controlled leak designed to satisfy your suspicion without revealing the full extent of the problem. The confession is just sophisticated concealment, giving you enough truth to stop looking while hiding the deeper truth underneath. Lesson 64. Epistemic learned helplessness. Truth is subjective. Everyone has their own reality. There's no objective way to know. All sources are biased. At first, this sounds like sophisticated philosophical nuance. But watch what it does. When someone repeatedly demonstrates that you can't verify anything, that all knowledge is uncertain, that reality itself is ambiguous, they induce epistemic paralysis. If you can't know anything for certain, you default to whoever seems most confident or whoever makes knowing feel least cognitively demanding. This manufactured uncertainty doesn't promote nuance. It destroys your confidence in knowledge itself. And once you're in epistemic helplessness, unable to trust your own capacity to determine truth, you become vulnerable to anyone offering certainty, regardless of its foundation. They're not teaching you critical thinking. They're disabling your ability to think critically by making criticism feel pointless in a world where nothing can be known. And in that epistemic void, their confident assertions become the only solid ground available. This is where our journey ends. Consider subscribing if you found this an interesting watch. Sleep well and good night.